Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healer specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. Thanks for asking, Rory. And both Rory and I are delighted you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 278. 3 stops on today's journey, starting at those student services, where we're going to be speaking about working with ethical dilemmas. Then moving on into the ethical sustainable practice, where we recognise many set up in private practice and we perhaps don't get the training that we would like on how to do that during our core training. And today, speaking about registering with the ICO. And then we move on to the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, Practice Matters, where we have an interview with Deb Barnard on her lecture that she did in our CPD library on emotions. So, kicking us off, Rory, those student services where we acknowledge the student journey. And of course, every student is going to face some kind of an ethical dilemma at some point, I guess.
Absolutely, Ken. And it just goes without saying, as I like to say, the letters in the post. At some point, in either in your placement practice, or even if you're a student doing skills, you're going to come across an ethical dilemma. And certainly when Ken and myself taught, it was one of the most discussed issues in counselling cohorts. Is this ethical? What do I do if this happens? What do I do if that happens? Now, in class, it's pretty easy to resolve. You could just stop everything, investigate what's going on, just have a bit of a conversation and move on. But when you move into placement, that becomes a little bit more pressing. And one of the ways of being able to manage ethical dilemmas is to have some kind of mechanism for ethical problem solving. Now, most ethical bodies now refer to ethical problem solving as a way of, if there's a problem presented to you, you have the ability to be able to think, right, what do I do with that, and make a defensible decision. So it's really important, I think, that anybody who goes into practice has an understanding of ethical problem solving. And for those of you who are regular listeners to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, I interviewed Adam Cooper, who was a professional military person, and he talks about action drills. In other words, when something happens in the military, you fall into a certain pattern of work and it becomes second nature. So as a therapeutic action drill, if you like, why not learn an ethical problem solving grid or matrix, so that when it happens, you're well prepared and you can make those decisions. And that is why we've included in this podcast a download of ethical problem solving, a 6-step process for you to be able to look at a problem and be able to make an assessment on what your likely actions are going to be. And to get that handout, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, episode 278, and it's ready there for your download. But I can't tell you, Ken, how often in practice something's come up, something's been said by a client, And I've had to go to that kind of ethical problem action drill, Ken.
Yeah. I think a good starting point when we're speaking about an ethical problem is to kind of define what an ethical problem would be, so we can identify and see it as an ethical problem. Because I have seen in the past discussions where someone has maybe faced a situation that is not an ethical problem, and they may claim, oh, that is not ethical, or I don't think you're doing that ethically. So how would we correctly define what an ethical problem might look like? What's an occurrence or an example of an ethical problem that we might recognize in practice, Rory?
Well, I mean, one of the first ethical problems is maybe somebody discloses that they know someone they say, oh, by the way, I'm getting married to your sister next week, something like that, or I work with a member of your family, or I'm starting I'm starting at a job, and you find out actually they're working in the same place as you. Have had that, or in one particular case, I know your supervisor. That happened to me many years ago. Someone knew my supervisor, and that became quite an ethical dilemma. I can't go into too much more than that, but one of my clients knew my supervisor at the time, and it was something that I had to work through. And then, of course, there are situations where people may disclose things. They may disclose that they're doing harm to self or harm to others, or they may be thinking of maybe things like drug trafficking. They may disclose drug trafficking. So it's a tricky one, and those are the kind of ethical issues that we might come across. Or even somebody who turns up to an appointment who's under the influence of prescribed medication, or even someone who comes and they may be under the influence of either street drugs or alcohol. Those are the kind of ethical issues that sometimes we face, certainly in placement, I think.
Nice. I like how you've defined that, and I love how you've brought that roles into it, where you might be seeing somebody who knows somebody that is a shared friend or a mutual acquaintance, and that happens more often than not, really. And specifically when you were speaking about I know your supervisor, for example, if you're working with if you're a counsellor and you're working with students that might be in placement, at some stage they could even share the same supervisor as you, and that would of course create an ethical challenge, because you wouldn't be able to take that client to supervision. There is a definite conflict within that role. I think that is a really good example, Rory. And of course, at a point like that, we would look to solve that problem, and we would maybe go to an ethical problem solving matrix or grid to be able to help us through that. Now, we have our ethical bodies, which will have the frameworks to which we work. And the first place to look is your ethical framework. Understand what the framework is requiring of you. And I think that the second thing that I wanted to say, Rory, is look at your contract. So you were mentioning, and one of the examples that you used was maybe a client arrives for a session, and you can quite obviously see that they may be under the influence of some kind of substance or alcohol. They're not 100% with it. They're not 100% there with you within that room. Now, if you have covered this in your contract, then you have less of an ethical problem, because you've already kind of laid out the rules of engagement of how you will work with this client. And I'm going to use an example that if you were working in a substance misuse service as a counsellor, chances are if somebody arrived under the influence, you would need to break that confidentiality and inform the service. And that is in protection of that client. And that is pretty standard across recovery services. So in that situation, you wouldn't really have an ethical problem, because it would have been discussed, it would be in your contract, and that client would know that if they arrived under the influence that you would have to break that confidentiality. But if that was not covered, in a contract and you hadn't discussed that, and maybe you're not working in a recovery service and the person does arrive under the influence, then you have an ethical problem. What do you do? How do you handle that client within the room at that time? And then what are your further actions? So pointing to your ethical body, the framework to which you work, understanding it and knowing it well, and then looking to your contract. What have you got covered in your contract before we decide that something is an ethical problem that requires us to turn to a matrix, Rory?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The first thing we have to do is define what an ethical problem is. So we have to define sort of whose problem is it? Is it my problem? Is it the client's problem? Or is it my problem? Is it both of our problems? And I think that's the starting position. You got to work out whose problem it is. And you are right in that sometimes ethical problems that we get or ethical challenges we get are not in the contract. They're sometimes outside of the contract. You can contract for as much as you want, but you cannot. You cannot get everything into a contract. And one classic one would be someone turns up and they sit in front of you and they say, by the way, I've had lots to drink and I've driven here. That is an ethical problem. That is an ethical problem right here. So whose problem is that? Well, that's my problem because I know about it. It's the client's problem because they're drunk under the influence of alcohol, which in the UK is illegal over a certain limit. So we're going to say that someone looks incapable of driving. They stagger into your room. And then finally, what are you going to do about it? What actions are available to you? Because can you let somebody go who's going to drive home under the influence of alcohol? And that is there right there is the ethical dilemma. And, whatever action you take, you have to make a defensible decision. And you would use, the ethical framework, and also you'd go into the part of the ethical problem-solving grid, if you like, or a matrix, where you would say, well, actually, what does the law dictate? And the law dictates you cannot drive under the influence of alcohol. Therefore, you could either phone Crime Stoppers or you could anonymously contact the police and say, you believe this person's under the influence of alcohol. Or probably a better way would be saying to them, look, you look like you're in real difficulty here. I know you've driven here, but maybe if you left your car keys at the reception, we could organise a taxi for you, or we could organise someone to collect you, because we can't really let you leave here under the influence of alcohol. And that is the kind of quick thinking I think that you need in circumstances like that. You need to have a fixed flow of ideas to be able to put you into a position where you're being ethical. You're working, in the service of the client, but in the case of the drinking and driving, you're working in the service of your community as well.
Yeah, I love that you've used that as an example, Rory. And the thinking is here to have that conversation with that client in that moment. If you're listening to this, you may think, well, that's a really difficult and tricky conversation to have. And that's why we have these discussions. And that's why we think of these things pre having a situation like this. But the other side of the coin is, if you don't have that conversation with that person, they get into their vehicle and either hurt themselves or somebody else, and there is some form of inquiry into that. What might that look like? It's not even thinkable for that person, for whoever may have been injured, for yourself as the counsellor, if that comes back to you asking, did you spot anything before they got in their car? So when we're looking at an ethical dilemma, the conversations can be quite tricky, but not having those conversations can be have a lot more impact on a lot more people. So we're sometimes called on to have really difficult decisions. And that's why having an ethical problem-solving framework or matrix that you can refer to is reassuring. It is there, I guess, in protection to us. And often the thought is, if if I see an ethical dilemma that comes up in my session, the very first thing I'm going to do as soon as that session ends is I'm going to contact my supervisor. And I'm not going to say that's not a great idea, but what I am going to say is there's a step before that. And the step before that is to write it down. As soon as you can, write down a description of what that problem or what that dilemma looks like and what you have done or not done within that situation before even contacting your supervisor. Because when you do speak to your supervisor, you can of course refer to what you have written down. It will maybe clarify what that dilemma looks like for you, and you are able to better explain that. And of course, if you do speak with your supervisor, you will note that as well. I think when it comes to ethical problem solving, you want to be noting down each step of the way. You mentioned, Rory, just in passing, you slipped it in. I saw what you did there. You said defensible decision making. And defensible decision making basically comes about if you are asked why you did what you did or why you did not do what you did not do, that you would have a way of defending the decision that you made that would show that you are a professional, that you went through a professional way of thinking and certain steps to arrive at your decision. And of course, you've already mentioned it, Rory, but I'm going to refer to the handout that Rory mentioned, and of course, we'll tell you where to get that in a moment. It was created by Professor Tim Bond. It is an ethical problem-solving matrix. You can hold it in your hand and have a look over it, and it'll take you through the 6 steps that Professor Tim Bond outlined for kind of working through an ethical dilemma or problem. And the very first question on that is, after making step 1 is to write it down and describe it. And then the very first question is, whose dilemma is it? Is it yours? Is it the client's? Is it both of your dilemmas? And Rory, you quite rightly mentioned the example of somebody under the influence who was going to then perchance get in their car and drive away. Whose dilemma is that? Well, it is both yours and the client's in that situation.
Yeah.
It really is. So that would indicate that we have to go to the next step on the ethical problem solving matrix. As soon as we've recognized that we are involved in this ethical dilemma, then we need to be part of the process. And then we need to look at the ethical principles and the guidelines. So again, you're going to be looking at how you are guided. What does your framework say? And very often a call to your ethical body. They should have an ethics department, somebody you can speak to. And I'm going to put it out here now. They might not give you an answer. In fact, they often will not give you an answer. They will say what the ethical frameworks suggest. But us, as the practitioners, we're running our practice and we need to make those decisions. And when it comes to an ethical dilemma, it is sometimes tricky. It's not always black and white, as it were. Ethical dilemmas can sit in a tricky area. So it's not always easy to get advice from others. But of course, we look to the framework. And of course, if you are going to phone up and ask somebody, you would be noting that down. We need to think of not doing any harm, doing the right thing and not harming anybody, not harming that client or those around them. We need to think about justice. We need to think about the respect for autonomy of a client to make their own choices when sometimes they are wrong, respecting the client's decisions, but at the same time, weighing that up against what else is at stake here. So in the case you brought, Rory, under the influence of alcohol, I'm going to get in my car and drive home now. Well, that is not a good time for saying, well, I have to respect the client's autonomy because they are breaking a law by doing that. They're putting themselves in danger. They're putting others in danger. And I guess if there was some kind of an inquiry that got back to the counsellor, it would be very strongly suggested, why did you not stop them from getting in that car? So it's and then of course we have to evaluate the outcome, which is the last part of any defendable decision making. We need to look at what that outcome is, and sometimes it might not be the outcome that we hope for. We may have to stop seeing a client. And in my case, Rory, I loved my supervisor. I was with my supervisor for over 3 years. An ethical dilemma showed itself. And again, and without going into any details, it was basically seeing members of the same family. And it got to a point where I was unable to when it was recognized, I was unable to take that client to my supervisor. So it was suggested I look elsewhere for a supervisor for that particular client. That was the solution. And I actually moved supervisors at that time. I think it was time for me to move on, but I didn't particularly want that. And it wasn't what I'd maybe hoped for, but it was the decision that was right for that time. When we're kind of looking back on it, did we consider all of the relevant factors? Can we learn anything from the process that we've just been through? And then the big hitter, Rory, would you do the same again if the same ethical dilemma presented itself?
Yes, and of course, Ken, I think it's easy for us to say, produce a brief description of the problem and take time to reflect. But I think the fact of the matter is that majority of ethical dilemmas that I've come across as a practitioner through the years I haven't had the luxury of being able to think and reflect on it. It's a case of have to take action now, have to do this ethical dilemma kind of matrix to get my thinking correct in the room. And I guess the other aspect to understand is that probably once you've broken confidentiality, because this is what we're really talking about with ethical dilemmas, usually in some cases, not usually, but in some cases, it could involve breaking confidentiality. It may have an impact on the therapeutic relationship, and therapeutic relationship may end. That's the reality of it. But sometimes you've got to think of the greater good. You've got to think of the law, our responsibilities to society and society in general. And I also think that when we're considering breaking confidentiality, that we don't hold on to little bits of ethical frameworks defending why we didn't. I read quite an interesting book on the law. Peter Jenkins, who has written a number of books on counselling and the law, and he said there's nothing worse, I paraphrase here, there's nothing worse than someone who holds on to a paragraph of an ethical framework to try and defend something which is indefensible. And the issue there is that, in some cases, you could end up in a coroner's court. It's going to be very rare. I don't want to scare people. It's going to be very, very rare. But you're going to be asked some very pointed questions. And one of those questions is, why didn't you take action? And it would be no good holding up an ethical framework or a code of practice saying, well, my ethical body says this. It wouldn't ring very well, because ethical frameworks are fitted within our wider society and the wider law, which is why you use an ethical problem-solving routine, if you like, to be able to navigate that and come to a decision which takes in all the available information and all the available laws and processes and come to a conclusion. But I would encourage anybody to practice this. This is something that's not often practiced, I don't think. Practice it in your triads, practice it in your skills, see how it goes. Make sure it becomes, as I said at the beginning of the piece, a bit of an action drill. So you could at least do the first two, or the first three. Produce a brief description of the problem. Whose dilemma is it? Consider all the ethical principles. And in the absence of direction, consider, are you doing the right thing? Are you doing no harm? Are you doing the right thing? And are you respecting the client? And then also, very important, identify the courses of action. But usually, in my experience, ethical problems and the decisions you make around them are almost certainly always going to be in the therapy room. And almost certainly, you're not going to have the luxury of time to think it through. You need to make a pretty quick response.
Thank you for bringing this topic, Rory, and thank you for creating the super duper handout. It is Professor Tim Bomb's 6-step process. It's ethical problem solving matrix that you can download. It is free of charge. You just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, make your way to episode 278. Download it, and like Rory says, take it into your triads. Go and give it a whirl, as they say. Go and try it, so that if this should ever arise in your practice at some stage or in your placement at some time, that you're not seeing it for the first time. And I guess that is today's Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counselingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your counselling tutor discount. That's counselingskillsacademy.com. And as we move out of student services into our ethical, sustainable practice, we speak today, I guess, again about a topic that seems to resurface again and again and again because it is so important and it is of the time. So we're speaking about registering with the ICO. So ICO is the organization in the United Kingdom that kind of oversees data protection and how it is kept, and you kind of register and you get a number. So if you're outside of the United Kingdom listening to this, it's still going to be useful for you because there's going to be an organization in your country as well. But for today, we're going to be referring to the ICO here in the United Kingdom, Rory.
Absolutely. The Information Commissioner's Office, which is the organization that's tasked with data compliance. In other words, that's an organization that upholds the law and in some cases enforces the law. And the law we're talking about is the 1998 General Data Protection Regulations, which is now known since Brexit as the UK GDPR. And you're right, Ken, this question comes up a lot, and it comes up a lot in our Facebook group. So if you want to join our Facebook group, pop Counselling Tutor into Facebook. You'll find us, knock on the door, say this every week. We'll let you in, and you'll be able to ask questions yourself and meet lots of really interesting people having lots of really interesting conversations. And one of the questions that comes up a lot is, do I need to register with the Information Commissioner's Office? I'm a private practitioner starting in my private practice. Do I need to register? And the other issue that comes up is, if I do register, will they publish my name and address? There's a lot of therapists who don't want their personal name and address shown in the register. So first things first, should I register, Ken?
Yes. That's my short answer, and we can go into why in a moment. But in 99% of cases, the answer is yes, you should.
Yeah, absolutely. And why should you register? Well, if you've got personal data that can identify a client that you store on an electronic device, so you may have on your computer, you may have an assessment form with name and address of the client, their doctor's details perhaps. You may have a phone number. You may store your clinical notes, although those are usually anonymized, to be honest with you, so there wouldn't be any recognizable data in there. But in terms of contact data, if you've sent a referral or to a colleague, or you've referred them to the doctor and you've had to write a letter of referral, that constitutes personal data. And if you're handling or moving personal data around, then you need to register with the Information Commissioner's Office. And of course, like everything in life, there is a cost. For most small counselling practice, I don't want to, be rude, but unless you're turning over £1 million in your counselling practice, it would be considered a small business, I guess. The cost is £40 a year, UK pounds, or if you put a direct debit in, it's £35, and that makes you compliant with the law. And most ethical frameworks say you must obey the law, Ken.
Yeah, very much so, and kind of the law says that you've got to follow the law as well. So if there's a sign
the law
that
says you've
says
got to follow the law.
if there's a sign that says drive at 30 miles an hour and you drive at 60 miles an hour, and you get seen doing that, you're going to be pulled up and you're going to be penalised. And if you said, well, I don't really know what that sign meant, it doesn't matter. You're going to go through the process of kind of paying for it, I guess, in some way, shape, or form.
Yes.
And we are called upon. This is a law. It is not something that we have to do, just another one of those things. It's not about ethics. It is the law. And that's why when we kind of open this up, it's really worth looking at the law of where you are. So if you're not based in the United Kingdom, look at your laws, because there will definitely be data compliance within your law. What does that say, and are you managing to stay within that? And we were speaking about the ICO and registering with them, and we were saying, do you need to? And you do if you are processing any data. Now, what does processing mean? Because that you may consider, well, actually, I don't think I am processing data. This is what the definition of processing is: obtaining it, recording it. And it's either of these. It's not all of them. It's any one of these. Storing it, updating it, sharing it. And there's a much longer definition of collecting, recording, organizing, structuring, storage, alteration, retrieval, consultation, the use of the data, disclosure of the data, dissemination of the data. I'm going now deep into the ICO website.
It's a big word, yeah.
Even erasure of the data. You are processing the data. So if you receive an email through a form that you have on your website of somebody saying, I think I might want to come and speak with you, and they don't even come to a session with you, and you delete that data, you are processing data, and by law, you have to be registered. It's as simple as that. And any kind of data that somebody could look at and say that identifies somebody. And again, when we're speaking about computers, we think about we would only process data on a computer. So the definition by the ICO is the following: cloud computing, so anything that is stored externally. So that would include calendars where you would keep appointments in, a desktop, a laptop, a tablet, a smartphone, and even CCTV. And I know we have CCTV on our property. It is for our protection, I guess. We put it up, or deterrence, I guess, Rory. And when I put up the CCTV, I went and had a look, because I recognize that people are walking past and their face may be shown on my camera and captured. What do I need to do? And I needed to go and put a little policy in place. Just as a private person, this is not related to business or counseling, just myself. I needed to put a little policy, which I dated and put one side. If it is ever asked for, I put up the relevant signs that say that the person is on CCTV. But it's interesting, I'm using CCTV just as an example. You may have CCTV in your home just for security. You may see a client from your home if they're caught on that CCTV. Even if all your notes are kept on paper, you are processing their data. And I guess we couldn't cover this topic without speaking about special category data. So as counselors and psychotherapists, there is certain data that we will process, handle, receive, delete, share with others, that is called special category data. And special category data is anything racial or of an ethnic origin, anything around politics, religion, trade unions, biometric, anything concerning health. And I think this is the important one, including mental health. And then for those that may work in certain niche areas, data concerning a person's sex life falls under special category data. And when you are approaching the ICO, it's worth having a think about that and maybe ticking the box for special category data, because as therapists, we are most certainly going to be receiving that. Even if a person says, I'm on such a medication, they are sharing personal medical data, which would fall into special category data. I don't think it's more expensive. if you are dealing with special category data, but it's just worth ticking the box when you go through the process of joining up with the ICO if you're not already a member. And then, Rory, I think what's the next step of this is when you join the ICO, go and put the ICO number, your ICO number, into your privacy policy on your website, so that any person looking at your website, if they look at your privacy policy, which is where we discuss how we collect and how we store and how we manage data, that your ICO number is there within that page, so that people know that they have accountability when they share their data with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I'd like to say a few words on the ICO. I've spoken to the ICO on many occasions. You know, when formulating policies and privacy policies and that type of thing. And I have to say, they're super, super helpful people. You know, they're not after catching people out. They're after helping people comply with the legislation. And they're really, really nice people, and very, very helpful, and very, very, very knowledgeable. And I did say at the beginning of this piece, there are a lot of people worried about having their names and addresses put on the ICO websites. So, you know, if you look us up, you'll find the business address. If you contact the ICO and explain the situation, they will anonymize your data. That's my understanding. Lots of people have said they've contacted them in our Facebook group, worried about the fact that their name and address is going to be on, especially those practitioners who work solely online, and you know, don't have rooms or don't see people in their own homes. And what they've done is the ICO have anonymized or removed the information, so that's not publicly available. But word of warning, you have to ask them. It's automatically put up as soon as you register with your details. It's my understanding it's automatically published, so well worth contacting them before and getting that process in place. But as Ken said, it is the law. You know, we have to obey the law, and unfortunately, in the UK, ignorance of the law is no defence. You can't say, as Ken said, I didn't realise that I couldn't drive at 100 miles an hour in the 20 zone. You know, what was that 20 sign? I thought that was just somebody's birthday or something like that.
A suggestion.
That won't, a suggestion. You know, if you could drive at 20 miles an hour, but I'll just do 100 anyway. I think that you might find yourself in a bit of difficulty, and that defence definitely won't wash.
Indeed. Well, I'm glad, Rory, that you've brought this topic. It's an important topic. It comes up again and again. And there you have it. So check out the ICO, and that is our ethical, sustainable practice. And this, I think, the focus today is on the ethics of complying to the law. We're called on. We don't have a choice. And then moving on now into our practice matters, the CPD section. I rub my hands together with joy each time, Rory. It's where we get one of our lecturers or somebody who has something really important to share with us, to share something that they have a deep interest in. And Rory, you spoke with Deb, and her lecture was about embracing emotions. And I don't think I've ever been in any counselling sessions where emotions didn't play a part.
Absolutely. And I spoke with Deb Barnard. She's done a fabulous lecture for the CSR and CPD library on embracing emotions and the emotional life of our clients, and why it's so important that we pay attention to that. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
The emotional landscape of our clients is one that sometimes comes to the fore in therapy. Working with emotions, understanding people's feelings, helping them to understand their own process of feelings is, I guess, the bread and butter of counselling and psychotherapy. So it's my great honour to interview Deb Barnard, who's done an absolutely fantastic lecture for us for both the counselling study resource and the Counsellor CPD Library, entitled Embracing Emotions. So, Deb, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you, Rory. Good to be here.
Yeah, so I guess the first question is, what's the common challenges that clients may face when they are, I guess, accessing their emotions? You know, is there any struggles that some clients may have working in an emotional landscape?
I think it's interesting, your introduction to emotions in that sense about being the bread and butter work, and I absolutely agree. And in terms of the challenges, I guess, I think I like to think about that not just to do with clients per se, but I'd like to include like us all in that question in terms of what are the challenges of emotional content, particularly I think within the Western world. I think we've got on the whole a pretty poor relationship to our emotional selves. And I'm a big fan of a woman called Carla McLaren, who's written a very big tome called The Language of Emotion. And she says that in the Western world, we tend to favor intellect and physicality and sometimes spirituality, but emotional content, she says, is really poor. And it's interesting when we think about that, I think as therapists, both in terms of ourselves, what are we like with our own emotional content, as well as the person sitting opposite us, when we get a bombardment of media and advertising that is telling us to strive for very specific emotions like happy, love, or content. And marketing is full of that. And then if you think of all the other like emotions on that huge rainbow of all the differences, so many of them just get very quickly closed down, or we've developed kind of tablets to get rid of them.
Yes.
So if you begin to think of any negative emotions like sadness, there's a tablet. Anxiety, there's a tablet. So what kind of message, I think, do we grow up with in relation to emotional content? So the biggest challenge, I think, often is normalizing emotional content and not shying away or feeling as if they're wrong to feel or that we should get rid of them. And I think that's some of the key elements to do with the work. So how can we as therapists, so if we're okay with the whole range of emotional content, we can remain steady in the face of emotional content that might happen opposite us. And if we don't kind of freak out or start throwing tissues at someone if they get upset or like closing down emotion, then I think, number one, that immediately helps somebody calibrate their own sense, their own relationship to emotions, because I'm not getting worried about their emotional content. And that's almost like a first starting point.
Yes. Yes. So to embrace your own the panoply of your own emotions, and to understand what they mean to you before we even sit in the room with a client.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are we able to hold our own emotional content well?
Yes.
Without fear or panic or feeling as if it's wrong?
Yes, and you do hear people sometimes say, I don't like feeling sad, or I don't like feeling anxiety. And they're all the panoply of human emotions, aren't they? Some emotions may feel better than others for us, but they all have meaning. Our emotional landscape has a meaning for the I guess the emotions that we're, that, as you say, are promoted, but also those emotions that can be difficult.
Absolutely. So the more uncomfortable ones are the ones that we tend to want to shy away from or that we want to suppress in some way. But then I guess the big question that we need to ask is, well, why do we have them? What is the function of them? What is the purpose? It's not a kind of a design glitch, as it were. they exist for a reason, and can we reframe how we see them? So if we take an emotion like fear, for example, Carla McLaren sees fear as our personal trainer. It asks of us to be in a state of readiness. Anger, she has a lovely quote about anger. She says, that's our personal sentry. Yes, she said, anger walks the parameters of our soul looking for breaches.
Yes.
And Gandhi was a huge fan of anger. He said it was his personal rocket fuel. It's what drove him in terms of his anger was obviously in relation to injustice. So anger often rises due to injustices. But as Gandhi said, it can be abused, it can be misused. So it's kind of acknowledging and honoring the emotional content and honoring the emotion. I think that's the way Carla puts it. How do we lean into an emotion, even when it's uncomfortable? It's almost like asking the question, I'm feeling this. I wonder, what is the message? What is that emotion asking of me?
Yes, and I like the idea of anger being a sentry, mainly because anger gets, I think, a bad press. Because when people say I'm angry, then people say, oh, you shouldn't be angry, don't be angry.
Absolutely.
And anger, a term I use, it's a bodyguard. Usually it's a secondary emotion. And you have to work out what it's protecting. Is it protecting shame? Is it protecting anxiety? And when I see someone who's angry, my instinct as a therapist, and I don't know if you would concur with this, is to kind of think, what else is going on?
Absolutely. And a question she would add to that is, what needs to be restored? Yeah. What do I need to pay attention to? And I think you're quite right. Anger is a lovely masking emotion for things like sadness often.
Yes.
You know. So exactly as you're saying.
So when we talk about emotions, and I guess if one could talk about effective strategies, would you say it was more of a mindset approach about thinking about the whole of the kind of panoply of emotions and thinking how those apply to us?
I think you're quite right. I think there isn't necessarily a book of neat tricks in terms of managing emotions. I think part of it, possibly well over 60% of it, is a shift in mindset. It's like a reframe, is to recalibrate our relationship to our emotional selves. Particularly, if I think about my upbringing, I often make a joke about the fact I was allowed two emotions, happy and quiet. And I know quiet isn't an emotion. Any other emotion I seemed to feel was closed down. So if I was crying, I had to stop crying or stop crying. If I was angry, I had to go upstairs until I'd stop being angry until I could come down. So we're very unrehearsed in terms of our relationship to these more traditionally difficult emotions. And it's recalibrating our relationship. So to not see them as the enemy, to not see them as they're there to hurt us in some way or to give us a hard time. Like students, like if you think about kids at school, there's huge increase in anxiety. And what's interesting, does anybody ever stop and go, well, actually, if you've got an exam coming up, you're kind of meant to be anxious.
Yes.
There is a reason why you're feeling anxious, but because we don't develop that relationship, anxiety just gets louder and louder and louder.
Yes.
Then it becomes an overwhelm when we don't listen, when we don't lean in.
I like that idea of leaning into our emotions. In other words, embracing them, meeting them where they're at, and trying to explore what it means. I heard a wonderful quote the other day, which it's one of those quotes that you kind of instinctively know, but until someone says it, you go, that's it. And it's anxiety and excitement actually are the same emotion. It's just how you perceive it.
Yes, exactly. And it's just how we name it.
Yeah.
So you and I, we could be going to a party feeling exactly the same chemical emotion.
Yes.
I could be feeling anxious, or that's how I describe it, and you might describe it as excitement.
Yes.
But it's coming from that same place in terms of the reaction in relation to a stimulus.
And I think I'd like to take back right to the beginning when we talked about the messages we get in our society with emotions, because you're right. We if I look on a Twitter feed or a social media feed, there's so many of them nowadays. They're always positive emotions. Be positive. Have positive emotions. And I think for everybody, but especially for young people, this is a pretty dangerous road to go down. Only embracing the positive.
I think you're quite right. It's a huge ask. And the danger is if we're kind of very subtly taught that that's what we should be feeling or that's what we should be aiming for, it's kind of unrealistic. So therefore, we can end up in this almost failure loop. Yes. In terms of our emotional selves, or if we're not living a very good life, or we can become self-judgmental, like, I don't feel happy every day. Well, okay, could we look at that differently?
Yeah. And it's also the messages you get from those around you. You spoke very eloquently about what emotions you were allowed to have. And of course, there's been times where I've heard people say, I don't like being around angry people. I don't like being around sad people. And sometimes that's their stuff, isn't it? It's the other person's stuff. It's not that person's. They're entitled to an emotional landscape.
Absolutely, yes. But again, that illustrates our poor westernized relationship to emotional content in a way. I mean, if we think of some of the great artists, for example, and some great art that has been generated, it wasn't necessarily created because somebody was happy.
No.
And that's really important to notice, in terms of the expression of emotions in a sense. And we do need the whole spectrum in order to be a fully kind of formed or integrated human in a way.
Absolutely. And I think art has a very powerful kind of place in terms of understanding emotions. There's a very famous piece of work called Guernica. I don't know if you've ever come across it, which is a representation, I think of the Spanish Civil War.
Yes.
And that is a truly difficult piece of work to look at because it almost demands of one to access those emotions that are so difficult.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think it is interesting the role that art plays or fantasy plays. And, is there a danger that we'd more readily cry over a sad movie? Or if we find ourselves, I can remember I did my own time of doing therapy. And I was totally that person who used to cry at movies, even the happy bit, But interestingly, after my therapeutic journey, that completely eased off because I wasn't using the movies in order to discharge emotions
Yes.
in a way. And so I became less tearful at movies and more able to be tearful in my own life, I think.
Yes, almost like the movies incited a acceptable position for you to show that emotion.
Absolutely. And some old tears would have been coming through, not just movie tears.
Yes. So almost masking the movie was a mask to be able for you to kind of transmit that, sadness and pain that happens somewhere else, not in the movie. Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And we hear this in client work a lot, don't we? Where clients will say, I've cried at this movie and I don't know why.
Right. Yes. Yeah. What's it touched?
Touched? Is it the movie or is it something else? I think this is an area that is sometimes neglected in therapy. We hear a lot of talk about emotions and working with our emotional processes, but I think the panoply of engagement is sometimes overlooked. In other words, the fact that we have an emotional palette and all emotions. My colleague Ken would often say, in therapy, all your emotions are welcome in the therapy room. Every single one.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's nice, yeah. No, and I think he's quite right. And I think it is about it is the reframe. You know,
Yes.
how do we see emotions as something that is trying to help us in some way?
Yes.
They're trying to give us a message. Even sadness, you know, sadness often, I mean, she will talk about sadness in terms of something needs to be restored or something needs to be let go of. But again, we can't always do that in life, and that's what's really difficult. So how do we manage that emotion then? So I do accept that some emotions can feel completely disabling and overwhelming. And there are certain techniques that we can do, and they are kind of, I mean, I want to call them like brain gym tricks.
Yes.
So it's not actually listening to the emotion or like leaning in. It's kind of managing in that moment. So if you're completely furious and angry, then if you sit down and do some long division, you've immediately asked your brain to focus on a very different area of functioning to enable the whole amygdala area, the fight and flight, to kind of all those chemicals to settle down a bit. And the same with breathing exercises or meditation. And that's what often would be offered, I think, in therapy. But there is a danger, again, that we're trying to manage them as opposed to listen to them.
Yes, I like that. And we should listen to our emotions because they're there for a reason. You know, we've not come through millions of years or thousands of million years of evolution.
A design flaw.
Design flaw. Yes, they're there for a reason, and the more we listen to them, the more we understand maybe why they're there. In your lecture, what do you hope that people who've watched your lecture may take away from it, that they may apply to their practices or may help them think slightly, you know, from a different perspective?
Well, the word that came to mind there is something to do with courage, I think. It's having the courage to lean in and not trying to squash them out in a way. And it's having the courage to be alongside difficult emotions, both in self and in others, without giving the impression that you're trying to close those emotions down. So for me, it's the reframe. And I know when I work with people, sometimes people say, and I felt this and I felt that. And I might go, so quite appropriate responses to given the situation. So there's the normalization principle that plays a part, I think. And that's something I hope people will take away, that emotions aren't the enemy, that we don't demonize them just because we've developed a tablet for most of them.
I think there is a wonderful place to, and, you know, emotions are not the enemy. Embracing Emotions, a lecture by Deb Barnard, is in the CSR and CPD library, and it just goes for me to say, Deb Barnard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Massive thank you to Deb. A massive thank you again to you, Rory, reaching out, holding these conversations, bringing us the CPD in the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You've been listening to Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 278.
We started off with student services, ethical problem solving, why it's useful to have some sort of ethical problem solving routine in kind of entrenched in your mind, written into your mind before you go and see clients, so that you're able to at least be able to manage an ethical problem when it is presented. We moved on to ethical sustainable practice, and we talked about data protection, and in particular registering with the ICO, certainly in the UK, also known as the Information Commissioner's Office. Lots of information around data protection and the fact that actually it's a legal obligation. It's not a choice. We have to if we're storing or processing clients' data. And then in Practice Matters, we talked to Deb Barnard about her lecture for the CSR and CPD library on embracing emotions. If you've liked this episode, why not share us on your socials? Tweet us out or send us across on Facebook. And also, if you're listening on a platform like iTunes, why not give us a 5-star review? And as always, stay grounded. and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.